All right. Hello and welcome everyone to another episode. I have a special guest with me, Aidan Jonah from the Canada Files, editor-in-chief of the Canada Files. And we're going to talk a little bit about what the Canada Files does, what it focuses on. It piqued my interest because there's a lot of stuff that goes on in Canada that I think people would be surprised by in terms of global capitalism and specifically the imperialistic ways that things are done. When we start going down this rabbit hole, the US is the obvious culprit for a lot of this stuff, but I think it's underappreciated how much their allies partake in this and also even cooperate on some of these operations. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about some of the stuff you cover, some of the stories you've looked into. And then towards the end, we'll talk about something that we encountered online where somebody came after you from the Free Tibet community. And they came after you for even just liking my post, which was really interesting and really tried to lay into you. And there's so much to unpack with that. But we'll leave that towards the end because I want to give you a little bit more of an opportunity to speak up front about what it is you do. So to start off with, do you mind introducing yourself and talking a little bit about what the Canada Files does?
Sure thing. So I'm Aidan Jonah, editor-in-chief of the Canada Files. We're a socialist, anti-imperialist, investigative news outlet focusing on Canadian imperialism. So we've been going for about 20 months. Actually, is November 2019 that this was started. Funny enough, I was actually only 18 back when this was started. So been at this for a little while, but it's a thing I really enjoy being part of and working on. This foreign policy journalism is, quite frankly, there really was a gaping hole. I felt, and so even though I didn't have much experience when I started, I just really felt the need that I needed to try to step in there and see what I could do. Yeah, so really just the deal is that it kind of started all around, like I mentioned, November 2019, and things kind of kicked into gear. It kind of took the pandemic, actually, to things kick into gear because in the really early days, actually, it was focused originally on more coverage events, video coverage, different types, multimedia. And it was the pandemic, and it was taking a critical look at the coverage that I was doing, and the Canada Files was doing, and realizing that it was actually doing similar things to the other outlets. And at that point, because I obviously I did activism before I came to journalism, so I've always been more of a mind of how is the journalism like helping movements, or how is it like bringing new things onto the table. And so at that point, foreign policy became the point of coverage. And it went on a daily news cycle for a couple months, and things eventually switched later on in the year, and then really confirmed early on, like this year, that it switched fully into investigations. Even though personally myself and of course associate editor Daniel Z, we had been mostly doing investigations since like early in the year before, but this year we really just firmly triggered that change once and for all. So.
Now, so as a young kind of student of journalism getting into this field, I mean, you must have known up front that challenging the status quo, going after these anti-imperialist kind of narratives, and certainly challenging things like the Xinjiang genocide narrative are pretty thankless jobs where you get a lot of hate for it. You're certainly not going to get many corporate sponsors. So why is it you wanted to take this route?
Well, I think it was a matter to me of what I saw that needed to be covered. I mean, I've always been the coverage in the media. I could have taken a very easy path to just be some sort of PR hack or something like that. But that was just never of interest. I mean, I personally don't care if I ever don't get to live the most comfortable life or whatever to do this kind of journalism. It's been the principle that's mattered the most to me. So. And also, I mean, to a certain degree, I was also well aware of these facts already. So I knew I was going to do that journalism regardless of the fear. And I realized, I think I came to the conclusion that the earlier I started trying to do this journalism, the better the chance that this might actually become something feasible over the long term, because and at its very core, right, this things just absolutely cannot stay the same in terms of the media industry and in terms of media in this country, if things are to move forward. And I think that was always kind of perspective, even in the early days, was just things were not good enough as they were, and things needed to change.
Was there a point in your life where you were kind of like a lot of Canadian kids growing up? We thought Canada's a friendly nation. We're not like the US. We're very different from the things that they do. Where you had this kind of epiphany moment saying, whoa, 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 hold on a second. We've got a lot of the same problems, and your whole kind of idea about how things work started to shift. Was there kind of like an epiphany moment for you, or was it a gradual thing? How was that?
I think it was a bit of a gradual thing as like high school kind of ended out. But it was really interesting in the sense that it was actually kind of the gray zones reporting on Xinjiang. That was really one of the first times where I was like, oh boy, okay, maybe maybe things are not as they seem. I mean, also I have to give real credit to Lee Camp and his Redacted Tonight show. Actually, that was one of the first ones that kind of helped me to critically question some of these things, and then eventually I kind of took that line of thinking into Canadian politics. Really, so it's interesting in the sense that I actually had some American influences to kind of start on. I just looked at kind of some of the stuff that was being done there and kind of thought, why isn't this being done here?
Right. So you wanted to kind of bring the same kind of a thing to Canada.
Sure,
even
with some modifications with some modifications for.
Well, yeah, for sure. I mean, Canada obviously has a unique set of issues as well. But again, digging into this kind of imperialism thing, I think we probably should have been aware from the get-go that these alliances, they kind of look out for each other, and they're all doing this similar kind of a thing all the way back from when the US, overthrew Iran's government for British petroleum. I mean, that should have been the beginning of a lot of red flags for people saying, whoa, hold on a second. These kinds of global North nations work together with these kinds of operations. And so what's been surprising for me, and I haven't dug into it too much, was Canada's involvement in a lot of U.S. operations going down into Latin America, South America, and everything like that. A lot of these coups, a lot of these things were shocked to learn about in the U.S. Canada's kind of been joining along for this kind of stuff. Have you started to cover any of that stuff? And do you have any kind of specific examples or things that you could provide us in terms of the kinds of stories you've covered so far?
Sure. So there's been a lot of things I hit on. Obviously, with Canada, there's been people, writers, and historian, more focused types that have really kind of shown how it's been something from the very, very start. In a sense, we've always been in an imperialist nation, whether it's like we supported the Boer War, I'm pretty sure, in South Africa, basically even around like the start of the 1900s, and like our support for coups and assaults on the sovereignty of Latin American nations. One of the prime cases, I guess, in the modern day of Canada really leading the charge for America would have to be the Lima Group. Obviously, that was founded a few years before Juan Guaido. Before they tried to actually shove Juan Guaido into power. And that was actually Canada's main initiative, founded in 2017, and then Guaido gets brought in as this fake president in 2019. That was Canada's main initiative. You had Chrystia Freeland, who was the foreign minister at the time, leading this charge, and so this was Canada trying to straight up lead the overthrow of a sovereign government, because they actually took care of their citizens and they followed policies that were really people oriented, rather than, of course, what's inherent in the nature of capitalism. So,
right, yeah, no, that's really interesting. That how much of an active effort Canada takes in these things for corporate interests. I find that one of the challenges, which is surprising to me, and I have to keep reminding myself of, is I dug into a video. There was a YouTuber who did this really weird hot take on the Afghanistan war. And like everything he was saying that he thinks China might do are things that the US is doing now and continue to do. And it was just out of touch with reality. And people were supporting him when I was responding and other people were responding saying, hold on a second. I mean, these are things the things you're worried that China will eventually do, you're doing right now. And they're like, oh, that's whataboutism. And what are you talking about anyways? And then when you say, when this guy was talking about supporting brutal dictatorships, I said, no, I mean, US doesn't only support brutal dictatorships, they install them. And they had no idea what I was talking about. And this particular person who I was engaging with became a little bit more open-minded. They're like, can you send me some resources? Because I really don't know what to believe and what not to believe anymore. So I was really impressed with that interaction. So I provided them with all the details, but they have no idea about Pinochet or any of these kinds of coups or anything like that. So it's a big challenge that you first have to recognize that, okay, the US is maybe one of the main perpetrators of this. Then it's a secondary thing that, well, actually all of these other little countries, all these allies are doing the same thing. It's like, I don't know how this process needs to go, but for you, presenting this information to the public, to Canada, what kind of a reaction are you getting though? Do you find that some people are saying, wow, I never knew about this? Or is it mostly a negative reaction in terms of people's understanding of the world being challenged?
I think it's very much been an interesting mix. There's been, I think the campus has been successful in turning a lot of people's eyes onto like the true nature of Canadian imperialism. And I think the fact the nature of how the Canada Files presents even the articles and investigations, I think is the key in the sense that the standard has always been very source heavy. It's been one of those things. Sometimes I see certain sites basically not including sourcing or these kind of things, and it is damaging to that credibility. It's hard for people that are so hardwired to hate certain enemy nations or such to question these things. But I think certainly there's been negative reactions. Of course, I mean, especially like you think among dissident groups or some of these that have been covered. Certainly, you do this work of this nature and investigations of this nature, you're going to take off certain people for sure. But it's been very much kind of a in between. It's not been, per se, getting piled on. Certainly, I remember the reporting I did on the Xinjiang Committee in Canada, the one that led to that genocide vote in February. That one was the closest I think I got to getting piled on because people got really angry about that. But
right,
really,
they do.
It was honestly, it was mainly just anger, just nonsensical comments. That's the thing, right? Is at the end of the day, while piling on per se is interesting, because like I said before, but the nature of the work the Canada Files does actually, I think, makes it very difficult for people that want to go after the Canada Files or go after the narratives. I think we're not actually an easy target for people, just because by the nature of the work we do, the investigating we've done, and I think the track record we've established.
And the references, like you said, I mean, your articles are full of all of your kind of sources and, source material and all that kind of stuff. It should be the kind of stuff that these people who really believe in the narrative should take an honest look at what you're doing, look at the sources, and come back with a valid rebuttal. But people aren't doing that. You're right. Like I think what you touched on, people being hardwired, to hate certain nations or being willing to just accept a narrative for face value is a really big issue. I ran into somebody the other day online who actually protested the Afghanistan war. He was involved in protests against that. And now he's uncritically accepting the narrative in Xinjiang without taking a critical look at it and just yelling at anybody and calling them genocide deniers if they even want to look at it critically. And when you look at all of the most profitable companies that were involved in the Afghanistan war, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, all of these military industrial complex companies, they're funding the Xinjiang narrative now, especially through ASPI in Australia. And it's like, and this guy is aligned with, there's a YouTuber called Lawai86, and he's been propped up by Paul Wolfowitz, literally propped up by the architects of our previous wars, these what many people refer to as war criminals. And this other guy that I'm talking about, who once protested the Afghanistan war, is now aligned with this guy too, who is being propped up by yesterday's war criminals, the same war criminals that he was not too long ago protesting against. It's just this bizarre thing, and I don't know. I don't know, what it's going to take for people to look at this kind of stuff critically. Now, you had some interesting experiences too, because the the stigma around even questioning the Xinjiang narrative got to the point where I don't know if this is something you want to talk about or not. This is something we spoke of before. It created divides even amongst the people you were working with and you were working together with. Is that something you're okay to talk about? I mean, that's something we talked about in private before.
Yeah, I can bring up a bit. I mean, it's something mostly in the past at this point, so I won't go too much into it. But it was mainly just one or two fairly long time contributors that just really just wouldn't have talked about these things, and it was weird because I honestly hadn't expected it. I hadn't gotten the sense of them because their general foreign policy had been pretty solid. And I think this is overall like part of a trend that people who have generally at least decent enough foreign policy stances just get absolutely hoodwinked by the most important imperial narratives, basically. And so, yeah, you had one or two of them essentially demanding the Canada Files change its editorial line on it, or demanding that they'd be able to write something about Xinjiang and the evil camps and just this nonsense, this paramount nonsense. And it was just very clear that it was just no, that was not happening. I mean, that's the thing about Canada Files and why I think it's very important as a media institution, why I'm happy to keep doing the work that I do with alongside Daniel, is because that line is very principled on the anti-imperialist socialist line. And a principled anti-imperialist socialist is not going to push the Xinjiang genocide narratives. They've been clearly debunked. And so that was the deal, really, is they just would not relent. I even offered them to just, if they want to only touch on subjects that weren't related to Xinjiang, basically, or China, that they could write about these things and just agree to disagree, even if obviously I wouldn't have been very happy with that at the same time. I would have been willing to give them still a route because I thought some of the other stuff they did was not bad, but they refused. And so that was the deal, basically, because the Canada Files took clear and brave stances on Xinjiang. We did lose 2 contributors. Was it worth it in the end? Look, I think sticking through was obviously worth it. And you give me the chance to deal with that situation 10 times, and I'd keep doing the same thing 10 times over. But was it a pain? Absolutely. Well, yeah, it was. It was at the time. It was for sure.
What were the internal conversations like, without getting into too many details? Like, were they, when they were disagreeing with your challenging of the Xinjiang narrative, did they come with rebuttals? Did they come with saying, okay, well, no, I'm going to address your arguments here, and this is why I'm going to fall in line with the Xinjiang propaganda, or whatever you want to call it? Or it wasn't really that. It was just like, no, that's my red line. I don't want to take that stance, without any real kind of backing up of their dissenting opinion. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, one of them it struck me more of a red line type of situation. The other one, it was strange. They wanted to debate me, and it was just weird because I even like sort of considered, and I was looking through all their sources, and it was like the Intercept and the BBC, and it's all these imperial propaganda rags, and I'm like, okay, there's a certain line where if you're citing all the imperial propaganda rags that are out there, there's not really a functional, actual good debate to have. And also on my side, it was a question of, would I really want to platform those kind of views that have been, look, they've been patently debunked. They have been patently debunked. And so that was the end game, really. And at a certain point, I decided that it just was not worth my effort. Like, there's just better things, more investigations and these things to do. And I wasn't going to play into these things, even if it meant taking a bit of a hit initially.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand. I have, like, when you initially said that, I was kind of thinking, okay, well, hold on a second. You know what? Just let him debate you. But the thing is the whole purpose of your outlet is to create content from the ground up, to do your own investigations. And if this guy just wanted to come into your outlet and parrot BBC and the Intercept and all these things, I mean, that's completely against what you're supposed to be doing. If he had built his case from the ground up without them, it sounds like you would have been open to a debate, to say, okay, all right, let's look at these original sources. Let's look at this original work that I've done and you've done, and let's discuss it. But he was coming to the table with printouts of BBC and Intercept. It's like, that's the impression I got.
Yeah, I will say the one thing. I think the person's pronoun. I'm not 100% sure about the person's pronouns. I think it was they them, but
Oh, okay. Sorry.
uh,
Yeah.
yeah, just in case. Obviously, you're not going to identify the person because it's in the past, but
Right.
yeah. So it was, yeah. At a certain point, it's just certain things are not worth it. I've always been of a mind to try to look at things in the bigger scale of things, and so the investigative reporting, the digging, these kind of things, that's the most important use of the time. So unless there was a real strong debate to have, or one that
Right.
there was more opportunity for like learning maybe on both sides, it just struck me
Right.
as something where it was not going to be a constructive exercise, and
Yeah.
at that point it's not worth it.
Now I know that's in the past, and the only reason I bring that up is because I'm just kind of curious about, for a lot of people, if there's just something that they're subconsciously not willing to challenge because they know the kind of backlash they're going to get. Like if you take this stance against this propaganda, I mean, if worse comes to worse, they got to find a job in a mainstream media outlet, and the BBC looks them up, and they were found to be challenging the mainstream media narrative on the Xinjiang genocide propaganda. I mean, that may work against them. So I wonder how much of it is just protecting their own future and protecting their own employment prospects. I often say, and this is why I appreciate what you do as well, that if I was in Canada and I was just working an ordinary job and I was just, or doing business in Canada, I would not be pushing back against this propaganda. I don't think I would be. That's what I just the risk would be too high. I've got a family to take care of as well and all this kind of stuff. And it's just, even doing it from where I'm doing it now, all of a sudden, the BBC's contacting me, asking me, what is it like to be a mouthpiece for the Chinese government, asking me these superficial questions like this and insinuating things. I get put on Al Jazeera. I get put on Voice of America, America's CIA propaganda outlet. It's like, man, I would not be doing this if I lived in the West, but I don't care. I'm here in China. They can't do anything to me, which is kind of ironic. I'm only allowed to say this from here. Whereas they think that there is an environment of free speech on their side. But I wonder if you feel like that might be a little part of the kind of reasoning behind why some people are just like, no, I'm not going to touch that. I'm not going to push back against that because the risk is too high. I don't know if you ever got a sense of that.
I mean, from one of them, maybe that might have been more of the sense. The other one, I got the sense they really genuinely did believe it. But I mean,
Oh,
that issue of people being afraid, I think, is really a major sense I get, and it's part of the reason why I'm so passionate in having this project in the Canada Files really succeed, is because at this point, yeah, there is this really strong sense, I think, among the generation that you have to try to hide these things if you want to get into the mainstream. I don't think there's like a proper consciousness of how inherently toxic the mainstream media is, and the role it really plays in the function of the entire society and manufacturing consent, or I prefer to say, as Mike Parenti said, inventing reality. And so, yeah, I think at its very core, with the work that's done with the Canada Files, I think it's very much about taking the lead. It's about being
right,
being the leader in this stances, and just being willing to stick your neck out at the end of the day, and hope that trust that there is going to be the backing and the support eventually when people realize what's going on and what's happening. So it very much is something to where, to most people, I guess reasonably enough, it's viewed as an incredibly severe risk to take it on. But that's where that real principle is required. That willingness to say, hey, if this doesn't work, look, I may not have a single outlet in this entire country that will ever publish me. There's a pretty good
right,
chance if this doesn't succeed, I might be able to work at like a Telesur or some other outlet, more left-leaning outlet abroad, but I'm probably won't have a single other place in the country to write for. That's the end
right,
game of it, right? And I'm willing to make that risk, and I'm willing to embrace that. But that is the truth, is I am basically setting every single bridge I possibly can on fire. And I think
right,
maybe for some people in my generation, that's a scary thought. And
for sure.
I don't know if everyone has what it takes to do that. I mean, it's certainly not something that you walk into at first and you think, I'm going to set every single bridge on fire. But I think when
it just ends up that way.
Yeah, it's one of those things where when it ends up that way, and when I've learned things I have through doing this and other things before that, I mean, it's just something that has to be done. It just has to be done. And
it really is important. Yeah, no, it really is important. And when you really reach out to people, I think it's important. There's an additional step. There's some people who you can end up convincing them on one issue and saying, hold on a second, there's a problem here. The mainstream media narrative is not very honest. But it's this interesting phenomenon also. One of my friends in Australia mentioned it to me too. Like, when you've got this, for example, anti-China propaganda, but they're utilizing a field which you are familiar with. For example, Australia tried to blame, environmental issues in Australia on China.
Oh, I saw that, yeah.
Yeah, with the Great Barrier Reef, kind of designation. So people who were experts in that, who were lawyers, who were environmental lawyers and activists and stuff like that, they knew it was completely BS. And I was talking to my friend, Jack James. Her name is Jack James, and she specializes in kind of analyzing Western propaganda. She was saying, but there's an interesting thing that happens, because I was asking her, I was saying, do you think that will open up these people's eyes, and they may, the next time they see anti-China propaganda, they'll think twice about it, even if it's not in their area of expertise anymore, now that they see how this narrative is being weaponized. And she told me, she said, well, there's an interesting thing that happens, and she's caught herself doing this as well, where you read something in a newspaper, in a news outlet, and you say, well, that's completely BS, because you know better. It's within your area of expertise. And then you flip the page and you read the next story and you just believe it. You just say, oh, wow, And I've caught myself doing that as well, too, where, I just hear a narrative about a place somewhere in the world, and I'm like, wow, that's crazy. I'm like, whoa, hold on a second. I can't take this as face value. It's exhausting, So, we obviously can't do this for everything in life. But that's why I'm hoping that outlets like yours can become a bit more mainstream, where people are like, okay, well, let me see what they're saying over here, and at least not come to conclusions so easily, because some of these things are dangerous. These are being used to promote aggression or a more aggressive stance against China, which could have disastrous results if kind of we reach a flashpoint where it turns into a more serious conflict.
Yeah, no, I'd really have to agree with you there. And I think the very core thing, and this is how I think I see, honestly, I've kind of come to the sense that I see media in a different way than a lot of people. And in that I very much kind of view media as something that really, really has to act in tandem with movements and anti-war movements. But at its very core, if movements want, and I think people in general want to be able to see kind of defeat of imperial narratives and warfare, is, I think, very much the entire media landscape, the mainstream media, has to be supplanted by independent, basically anti-war outlets. There has to be an entire paradigm shift. I just see the entire apparatus as utterly toxic. And you might be surprised, right. I mean, coming from someone who's in the industry, and I know people who might want to go into the industry. I mean, look, at the end of the day, this industry is utterly irredeemable and in its current form, and it needs absolute change. It cannot stay in this current way if movements want to go anywhere. And I mentioned the kind of coalescing, in my kind of view, the need for coalescing between media, independent media, and anti-war organizing is just really because I think part of the failure of the media, in the sense, and I think it's intentional in the sense, is that it holds this very liberal ideological stance on media, in the sense that it's supposed to be detached from reality itself, when it's patently is not. And in fact, media drives much of reality, I would argue. So at its very core, I think, to me, just the media landscape is utterly unbearable. It has to be changed. And I think the only way you're going to see real significant societal change is really in a firm alliance, really, between independent anti-imperialist media outlets and kind of figures and anti-war movements. I think that's really the future.
Yeah, I think I hope that we can kind of get there with Canada. There was a really interesting movement that I saw happening recently, and I wonder if it's just out of pure desperation for the fact that there's been no really good quality political party in Canada for a long time, but Vote Communist was trending on Twitter in Canada, and the Hamilton region, their membership, increased by fourfold. And I think I don't know much about them. I follow a bunch of them, and I really appreciate a lot of their articles. Very anti-imperialist as well. But honestly, I'm a bit and this is something I need to have a discussion with one of them on. I'm really interested to talk to one of them about this. I'm a bit pessimistic about their movement achieving what those ideologies are supposed to do. Taking back certain infrastructures into the public realm, not having as much corporate control over society. I think we're too far down that road where it's really, really difficult to pull it back. I mean, it's the corporations that are really in charge now. But on the other hand, I feel like perhaps what they can do and what you can do, as pessimistic as I am that we can't make an incredible amount of change, and I might be wrong on that, and I hope I'm wrong on that, at least we can prevent it from going further down this path. Because if you compare Canada to the US, I think Canada still pales in comparison to what the US does and how the corporate infrastructure has taken over society. Our society, as far as I'm aware, I haven't looked at the numbers, hasn't reached the same kind of critical issues in terms of the wealth gap as extremely as extreme as it is in the US. It doesn't have the same kind of a homeless problem.
I still kind of, from what I've seen, at least we do have somewhat in their range still. I mean, for sure, I don't think our problems are as blatant per se, but I mean, if you, I'm not sure if you've seen the encampment clearings that have been happening across Canada recently, and I mean, for the past while, and I mean, it's really, really brutal. You're seeing open class warfare at this point happening.
Right. I did remember
Canada.
seeing the police going in and clearing out the tents and stuff like that. I mean, I've been out of Canada for so long, 13 years. So I'm going, and I've been focusing more on what the US is doing because they have more of a direct impact on the rest of the world. That I've become a little bit disconnected from what's going on in Canada, which is also why I'm appreciating what you're doing, because I can kind of reconnect with what's going on. So you're saying it's progressed down a pretty dark path already.
Yeah, I would really argue so. I mean, if you even look at what's happening in Fairy Creek, British Columbia, where there's Indigenous land defenders and allies and people that are trying to fight against old growth logging that's happening. It's really destroying some of the area and really hurting the fight against climate change. You see that happening in the police brutality, RCMP brutality, and I mean, BC is one of the best demonstrations of the failure of social democracy in trying to fight the problems of capitalism, and it's been especially the problems of Canadian colonialism and imperialism. It's been an utter failure from their part from the start, really. And so, yeah, I mean, obviously, I just don't see. I diverge from you in the sense that I do believe that the change is still possible, but in a way, it might sound odd, but I don't think there's any choice but to have that change happen.
Right.
That's the interesting thing for me is I think in terms of the Canada Files and these kind of initiatives and these anti-war movements is I've always been of the mind that there is no choice but success. Every single move that I've operated has been on with the idea that these things will succeed. And I mean, for what it's been worth, it actually has happened. I think there is that need for that revolutionary optimism in the sense that you're fighting in such a crazy world that you just that has to be the way we stand on these things.
We need to have a younger generation that's less pessimistic than I am, and I'm glad to see that because I was ready to settle for with Canada just not progressing even further down the path. But it seems like we're far enough down the path where there just needs to be a reversal, and maybe that's why people are looking to these alternative political parties now, saying that just something has to change. But yeah, I mean, I hope that there's an ability to make some change. Now, what I want to do, if you don't mind, I want to pivot to a different section where it's not only about Canada doing some of these things on their own. I was really surprised to know how much influence U.S. narratives have in Canada through funded groups. You've uncovered a lot of stuff with the NED, National Endowment for Democracy, out of the U.S., and a so-called NGO funded by the U.S. government, whose founder said that what they used to do covertly, what the CIA used to do covertly, they now do through the NED. So we're talking about regime change and just really disrupting politics of foreign countries. That outlet, NED, is also funding activists in Canada. And these activists and these groups are getting involved in parliament. They're getting involved in these government panels. They're helping to shape government policy. If that was happening on the same level with Chinese-backed funding or Russian-backed funding, that would just absolutely not be acceptable. But I was really shocked to find out how much the U.S. has infiltrated Canada in terms of that. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Because you ran into this with the Uyghur activist groups and with the Tibetan activist groups, and that's one interaction that I'm going to dig into a little bit later on with you in terms of the guy who came after you for liking my post. But tell us a little bit about the landscape of American funding that's coming into shaping Canadian policy.
Yeah, for sure. On the Tibet thing, I'll quickly jump in to say that because they've hid their corporate structure and they're registered as a corporation, basically to be able to release as little public information as possible. Because of that, it's actually really impossible to determine if they are individually funded by the NED. But Students for a Free Tibet, the head organization which they are a part of, and look, there's no doubt they get money. The Canadian organization of that group will get some money from that organization. So there is a sort of an NED connection, but not a firm NED connection. But what is very firm is that there are two groups that the National Endowment for Democracy is funding in this country, and not publicly. They're not talking about this at all. If you go on their site, you're not going to find this. The first one is this Uyghur rights advocacy project, which actually its executive director Mehmet Toti actually ended up playing a driving role in this subcommittee around Xinjiang.
On the genocide vote,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, basically, no. This is the report that led to that vote.
Okay.
And so basically, you have the subcommittee, right? And you have 5 out of the 8 MPs. They joined this parliamentary group that's created. It's called the Parliamentary Uyghur Friendship Group that was created in February 2020, midway through that committee's work. And guess who's also in that group? You have Mehmet Toti. And so Toti will go on to testify like 4 months later. There's no conflict of interest notes, no warnings about that. I went through all those transcripts, all that. There's nothing. Basically, he's supposed to be some sort of objective witness. And then they have the nerve to not actually go and invite someone like Ajit Singh or Max Blumenthal or Gareth Porter, people like that have done the reporting, that have done the debunking. Basically,
who aren't government funded.
Yeah. Like I asked them, and they were like, "Nope, we didn't get invited." And then you have instead you have people like Adrian Zenz, ASP, the Uyghur Human Rights Project, which directly takes millions of dollars in funding from the NED again. You have this whole motley crew of imperialists just running amok, basically, and everyone's enabling it. All the political elites and people in that committee enable it, and that ends up leading to the Xinjiang genocide vote, where it's unanimously voted on. And you have the so-called socialist heroes like Matthew Green running around, basically claiming, voting for it, and claiming that China's committing genocide when it's not. And here's the kicker: is I had forgotten about this for a while. Matthew Green actually went 2 days later when I think it was their ad is Andre Domise on Twitter, went and actually openly criticized Green for that vote. Green just went straight up and called this person a tanky, and then basically, right. And then
he's from Hamilton, right?
Matthew Green, yeah. And then the thing is, right, Green also went and called China imperialist, and he tried to make the false, basically yet again another debunked claim that China had imperialist activities in Africa as well. And so you have this one was really like, how to put it this way, I was very much a hard socialist. I've for almost like a year, almost a year and a half at this point. But how to put it this way, I was never going to get involved with social democracy again, but I at least wasn't going to rip into them on a certain more wholesale level. And this was was very much the breaking point, I think, for me, because you you only had I think it was 2 or 3 NDP MPs abstaining. Like Nikki Ashton is the one NDP MP I have some respect for, because she at least has some principle. Like the Libya vote was terrible, to vote to bomb Libya in 2011, but at least there was an apology there, and I think she's probably like the best that social democracy can offer, even if it's absolutely going to be nowhere close to enough. But at its very core, right, you have the NDP almost uniformly, other than like 2 or 3 of the MPs, voting in favor of this. So you have those people, them abstaining, and then it's only them and the Liberal cabinet, including Trudeau, that abstain. So you have a total like arm lock between the political elite in this country, really being unified and pushing this Xinjiang genocide narrative. And you've seen deteriorating relations get even worse as things go on. I mean, I guess the one at least positive thing, I guess, is the fact that China is finally slamming Canada for the ongoing genocide against Indigenous nations. I think China should have been going after Canada for that, just on the validity of the issue alone sooner. But I think China's finally, I think we've probably both seen this overall over the past few years. They've stopped trying to play nice to a certain degree. And I think it's been a really good thing to see. But
Sorry, go ahead.
No worries. So with that, well, obviously, to a certain degree, and I didn't expect them to fund. I had a feeling, to be honest, though, I'll be honest, that they were funding more groups. I didn't have the time to look at it when I was doing it. But then there is a whole interesting story. It might take long to get into, but I'll give you the short of it at least. Is that I was looking at this strange book by this reporter, Sam Cooper, try to claim that Canada was infiltrated by the evil CCP agents, and that the drug problems that were happening in Vancouver and BC were all the evil CCP's fault. This is just hysterical, nonsensical narratives, right? But somewhere down along the line, I was doing some research into 1 or 2 groups, and I actually, by accident, because there's this group called the Center for Law and Democracy, and I somehow ended up popping onto their name. And so when I searched on their site and I looked into their funders, it was just like, oh crap! Yep, they're funded by the NED. They're also funded by the NED, and it's like, oh, we have a pattern now. So yeah, it's very much with a lot of these NED funding, you just kind of tend to, if you research hard and long enough, you tend to find these things almost to a certain degree, not so much intentionally, but they just, if there's a will, there's a way, I think is a lot of the way to put it. And I just don't think there's been a will for a long time.
Right. Before I talk about some of that funding, you mentioned Matthew Green. When he said your tanky takes are terrible, my guy, he was talking to somebody who's actually a friend of his. And this Matthew Green is supposed to be this anti-imperialist guy as well. And so I actually sent him a message. Yeah, I sent him a message when he said that. I said, Matthew, would you be interested to come on my show to talk about your vote in favor of the Uyghur genocide motion, what it means, its importance, and what you hope the next steps are? I'm a Canadian podcaster with 100,000 plus subs on my channel. It didn't reply. I got a lot of upvotes. People wanted to see it, 114 likes. And then I followed up a few days later. I said, what do you think, Matthew Green? Many of my subs are suspicious of the narrative. You're obviously very confident about your position. Speaking about what considerations went into your conclusion could work well to sway a few people who are on the fence into your direction. I really wanted that discussion to happen, and I wanted it to be a respectful discussion. Not at all. Not interested, because he can't back that up. There's nothing to back up the Xinjiang genocide narrative. And when there were these US-funded groups going into parliament, weaving the story of a genocide, nobody was invited who had a dissenting voice. None of these people, like you said, independent journalists or academics who disagree with it, were invited along to really challenge the narrative in any meaningful way. Had China had their own government-funded NGOs, so-called NGOs, send some of their guys into this to say, no, you guys are wrong. This is not what's happening in Xinjiang. Nobody would have listened to them because they were funded by the Chinese government. They wouldn't even invite them in. They'd kick them out right away, say, no, what are you talking about? But instead, they're okay with US government-funded activists going in, even though we have a history of knowing that the US continually lies over and over again for geopolitical interests, whether it be false flag attacks to excuse the Vietnam War, whether it be the Nayera testimony of Iraqi babies being thrown from incubators, which ended up being a PR firm stunt, whether it be the weapons of mass destruction, all of this stuff. We know that the US lies, but they're being freely invited in. Their activists are being freely invited in to shape Canadian policy, to turn aggressive against third-party countries, which are in the targets of the U.S. government. I think it's just unbelievably ridiculous what's going on here.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. And the thing is with a lot of some of these dissident groups in the country is they utilize these corporate structures to actually, in a lot of cases, make them really not have to disclose much financial documents, and they don't really a fair bit of them don't really talk about who funds them or who actually supports them. So there could actually be way more influence than either one of us has a clue about right now. And I mean, this is part of the reason why the Canada Files Project is something that's very much in my mind to keep considering, keep fighting for, and pushing on with, is just because it's very much been even like 20 months of reporting and investigating is just starting to lay the groundwork for years of further investigating. I honestly barely think we've even hit the tip of the iceberg here.
Right.
It's utterly staggering. I think I really think there is like a conscious campaign to manipulate the development of Canadian political thought in this country. I don't think there's enough of a consciousness, and the fact that I think there is to a certain degree a bit of a risk, a sovereignty, kind of inherent sovereignty risk. I mean, because I'll mention this just because in the more recent investigation I did, there's a couple things. So first, the major thing, of course, is I'm sure you're aware of George Soros, who's the right-wing, liberal. I'd say liberal is the right way to put it. Financier, who's, look, he's just more of a actor of capital than any sort of big conspiracy or whatever. Just get that right out of the way. He's not in some sort of big conspiracy, but he, of course, has his Open Society Foundations, which played a pretty big role in toppling socialism basically across Europe, across Eastern Europe. And
destroying currencies also, part of the Asian financial crisis with destabilizing the Thai baht. He tried to go after the Hong Kong dollar, but the Chinese government backs it up, which probably left him pretty angry. He lost out on a bunch of profit there, and now he's calling China the greatest threat to the world, probably because he dug into his pocket a bit when he wasn't successful to kill the Hong Kong dollar. Sorry for to
oh, no worries.
That, but yeah.
Also, actually, he had a something called the China Fund from 1986 to 1989, actually, and that of course got crushed, I think, for good reason after a lot of the chaos that happened in that year. So basically, I think there's also especially more of a reason for him to be bitter, because I think there certainly was regime change intent. I think he most likely thought with the opening up period there was an opportunity to do that, and of course he couldn't have been more wrong, luckily. But I think there was an intent to try to do that. And so, yeah, he's very much been vocally anti-China. But the reason why I mentioned Open Society Foundations is actually because of this group, Transparency International. This is getting back to the Cooper book, anyways, which is just a complete. We could talk about that for a whole hour and a half. I read through that book; it was torture. Basically, the things you do for journalism. And so, basically, with this Transparency International Canada, right? The reason why it became worthy or noteworthy to me is because basically Open Society Foundations was actually kind of secretly running money to Transparency International Canada and two other NGOs through not this front NGO, but basically through a pass-through NGO called Impact, right? And so here's the thing where it gets even a little crazier. Impact used to be called Plan Africa Canada. It was founded like in the mid-1980s, and it was actually originally essentially like a funding space where CETA funds would be distributed in terms of projects around Africa. So you essentially have this organization that started as a CETA's disbursement pool, then taking money, basically then doling out this money secretly from Open Society Foundations to Transparency International Canada and these two other NGOs in Canada. So, and this was genuinely stunning to me. The fact that you have essentially secretly this funding occurring. There's an irony, and this is really a trend where you have a lot of these organizations hiding it, and then one organization is just a tiny bit more transparent and actually does admit to the funding. And it was Transparency International Canada, funny enough, that just openly admitted in their annual report. But I remember looking at it as it didn't make sense to me at first because I couldn't see the Open Society funding. And then once it clicked that Impact was that pass-through organization, then I was like, oh, okay, wow. And it was staggering for me. It's right. I mean, with the NED, because this Center for Law and Democracy, right? This is the second group that's funded by the NED in Canada. It's also funded, actually, funny enough, guess who, from the Open Society Foundations. It gets money from the Global Affairs Canada, a couple European foreign ministries, the EU. This is something interesting and something maybe is maybe more for a Euro investigative outlet to dig into. There's this German kind of semi-NGO that operates in the vein of the NED called the GIZ, which is also funding this group. So the Center for Law and Democracy is yet another example of really foreign-funded groups pumping out these kind of views that benefit these imperialist countries. And I mean, this is the example, really, I think one of the strongest possible examples of showing how much of a joke the media space has been for a long, long time, and like why.
Yeah, and why isn't this uncovered?
Yeah, this is why something I'm very clear on the need and the importance of Canada Files in this media landscape is just because, look, if the Canada Files isn't there, I mean, this just doesn't get covered because there just isn't the will. This is not information that is incredibly hard to find, I would argue. I think a lot of people could do this if they wanted to. I think it's really just a question of will. I mean, even someone like Daniel Z, who is the associate editor, he actually, I met with him through this group called Courage Coalition. I'm not really a part of it anymore, but he never did journalism at all, basically. And he never really had any sort of like figure or really was well known. It wasn't really well known at all. But he just put in the work. And you see the investigations that he's done now. But at its very core, right, it's just a total failure of the industry. But I mean, hey, if the Canada Files is going to be, if they're going to leave the Canada Files in the situation that it needs to be that leading force, I'm happy to embrace that.
Yeah, I hope definitely you fill that gap. That's interesting. The only one that was really transparent was, of course, the organization with transparent in its name, because I would imagine that they were probably looking at that saying, you know what, if we hide this and somebody uncovers it, our entire organization is discredited. We've got transparent in our name. But, you know, it's interesting. It seems like, you know, if you compare that to Australia, it seems like funding the narrative and influencing public opinion, they're a little bit more sneaky about it in Canada. And I wonder if they have to be by nature, because with Australia, one of the major ways they influence Australia is, of course, ASPI is Australian Strategic Policy Institute, is funded by the U.S. State Department. It's funded, by military industrial complex, military equipment manufacturers, and they have this narrative they can use because Australia is way down there on its own, closer to China. You guys got to be really careful. The big bad China's next to you. They could fire missiles over to you. You know, you got to be scared of them. Military industrial complex wins because they sell them China threat prevention weapons for the China threat narrative that they just finished promoting. And they just generally break apart the relationship with China. And it's ironic, too, because then Australia starts selling less coal to China because of the breakdown in the relationship. And who picks up the business? The U.S. picks up the business. And Australia's like, well, hold on a second here. So
yeah,
they could be a little bit more.
It isn't a reliable ally. It's really as simple as that. And I wanted to mention something because you mentioned the State Department that actually rung a bell. Is there's actually even more influence, something that I wasn't originally planning to talk to, but I exposed this disinformation watch initiative that was founded by this Emma MacDonald Laurier Institute senior fellow. It's just a supposed independent think tank, but it's just funded by like the Kochs, mining corporations, oil corporations, and these wealthy networks. Why I mention it, right, is because of disinfowatch.org. This one is funded by the United States State Department Global Engagement Center, which was created by Barack Obama, supposedly to quote unquote counter foreign propaganda, along with Journalists for Human Rights, which is an organization that I'm kind of keeping an eye on and looking into over time. But the most important part, you have a disinformation watch organization claiming to fight disinformation that is literally funded by the U.S. State Department.
Yeah, notorious for putting disinformation out. You know, this is where I think they've got to definitely get a lot more creative with Canada, because Canada's like it shares a border with the U.S. We're right beside the U.S., so they can't use the same tactics as Australia. You know, stoking fear based on their isolated nature down there. I mean, we're right next door to the biggest military power on earth. You know, we're like the younger brother. We have an older, dysfunctional, mass murdering criminal brother, to our south that can look after us. So they definitely got to get a little bit more creative.
I think they actually do. I think stoke fear. If you look at the Arctic region, especially, there's a lot of propaganda and fear mongering about Russia and China around the Arctic regions, of course, in the northern,
for sure,
northernmost regions of Canada.
Yeah, my point is they can be a lot more blatant with Australia, for a number of reasons. Because of they're isolated, they can create more of a military threat story, but also I think perhaps they have to be a little bit more underground with Canada, because I don't know if you grew up the same way. I'm a bit older than you, but growing up in Canada, we're proud to be different from the U.S. You know, one of the things we jokingly kind of carry with pride is we say we won the War of 1812, we burned down the White House. You know, when we talk about how when Americans, back in the day when they were backpacking around Europe, they used to stitch Canadian flags onto their backpack and wouldn't admit that they were Americans so that they'd be treated better. We always had this little rivalry going on. I mean, it was a friendly rivalry, but we always were proud of distinguishing ourselves from America. If people really knew the true extent of how much America is influencing Canadian opinion, I think a lot of people would take issue with it. Whereas Australia, they've openly called themselves America's deputy sheriff in the South Pacific, in the region. I don't think that would fly in Canada, where they just blatantly, call Canada, "Oh, we're America's little deputy sheriff." No, I don't think Canadians will like that. So I think maybe that plays into it too, where they just got to be a little bit more sneaky, a little bit more covert about these the funding operations when they're influencing Canadian opinion. But they certainly are influencing Canadian opinion. It seems like it.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I mean, there's a consciousness to do it around, of course, Europe as well, and America further, because there's also this really curious case of the NATO Association of Canada. And so this one was probably the most stunning in the sense that this organization has existed, I believe it was since, let me check to be exactly sure here. It was founded in 1966, originally called the Atlantic Council of Canada. And so this NATO Association of Canada now, this was not dug into for 55 years. 55 years. This wasn't dug into. And I looked into it as part of the foreign influence. This thing's staggering. It's actually basically it was founded originally directly with Canadian money, Canadian government money. They in the testimony to the Senate that I saw, they do say they moved away from it after a few years. But then they don't exactly take much better funding than what they previously did, which I'll get into later. But the thing with the NATO AC is it's actually part of this thing called the Atlantic Treaty Alliance, which essentially it actually features the rather infamous Atlantic Council in the USA, which I'm sure your followers are well aware of. And
yeah,
so,
they run just a brief for followers. I mean, they're very involved in foreign policy. Also, they were very involved in social media, censoring social media, deciding what gets to stay and doesn't stay. They had the campaign to remove Russian bots off of Facebook and Twitter and all this stuff. They were running it. They're funded by NATO. I believe if that's correct. Did I remember that correctly? Do you remember that offhand? Or they're involved with NATO somehow.
For sure
Pretty much
involved with NATO somehow. I know for sure
yeah,
they take funding from like the UAE. They take money from Open Society foundations,
right. And
Rockefeller
yeah,
Foundation, et cetera, et cetera.
right. And after those campaigns, of removing so-called Russian bots, they found out that it was just a bunch of ordinary people. Like there was
Yeah.
a pensioner in England who didn't like the narrative and was talking against it. He was labeled a bot by the Atlantic Council and removed off of Facebook. So they are very much part of the apparatus of controlling the global conversation for sure. But yeah, so if you want to continue, so this Canadian organization is tied up with these guys.
Right, for sure. And of course, they're part of the Atlantic Treaty Alliance. And so this NATO Association of Canada, it is nothing short of a NATO propaganda institute. This thing tries to claim that it's educating and engaging Canadians about NATO, and gets the kicker. They claim NATO's supposed goal is of peace, prosperity, and security. That's the kicker. Basically, and one of my biggest frustrations, and this is a passion of mine because of the fact that I am 20, like I come from the younger generation, is they very, very much are really focused on propagandizing Canadian youth into firmly believing that NATO militarism and political interference in sovereign nations is somehow a campaign for peace and justice. It's really just utterly unacceptable. And I mean, NATO AC, as I'd refer to it, or Association of Canada, is one of the most insane things. I'll use that word so you don't get a strike on YouTube. It's really crazy. I want to just I want to read this in 2007, just a few of these names because it's insane. So some of their partners and partnering organizations that included, you had three Atlantic Council organizations. You had basically the Center for European Policy Studies. You had the International Crisis Group. You had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 NATO divisions. Then you even have the Bulgarian, Czech, Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian, and Slovenian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You have, like at least four basically Canadian military institutions. This institution is so wed into the bedrock of Canadian imperialism. It's open collaboration and engagement with so many foreign powers. Like people just don't grasp the depth.
So what is it within Canada? What is its actual purpose? Like, what is it doing? It's also guiding Canadian foreign policy. It's also interacting with our government in Canada to kind of guide these kinds of policies. Like, what is it exactly they've got their hands in? So we know they're associations now, but what is it they do?
Sure. So their purpose is to drive support for NATO and to build support for it, to engage with these imperialist military figures. A lot of it really is manufacturing consent, let me say it again, inventing reality. That's its work at its very core. It's pure propaganda.
Part of the war consent manufacturing apparatus. Now, there seems to be a lot of stuff, and I'll recommend. I want to wrap this up with the story of the guy who came after you, but because we could go on for ages. You've got a lot of stuff that you've covered, and I highly recommend people head over to the Canada Files to check out more, and also show their support if they like what you put together. Because as I said before, you're not going to be receiving too many corporate sponsors interested in supporting your work, which tears apart the corporate structures of our current world. But yeah, no. So what we'll do from here is we'll talk about one of these NED attached groups. As you were saying, it's the Students for Free Tibet. Did I say it correctly? Is that the organization?
Students for Free Tibet Canada. Of course, like I said before, it essentially kind of takes money, certain degree through pass through. So it doesn't directly take this money. So technically there is no proof that it takes money, but if you really engage in your critical thinking skills, it's most likely that it receives money that this organization originally took from the NED.
But it is 100% aligned with Students for Free Tibet America.
Yes,
right?
Yes. It is literally a subsidiary of it. Yes.
Okay, and then the parent group is funded by the NED.
Yes,
I mean that has been established. So there's a connection. So we got this guy. He initially interacts with me. He's a Tibetan who was born in Nepal. He's never been to Tibet, as far as I understand, and he's in Canada pushing for a free Tibet and pushing a lot of that propaganda. He worked with that group, that NED-aligned group, and he came on my radar because he retweeted something. It was really weird. There was this cancer researcher who somebody found out that she wrote a book on noodles and dumplings. Like, she wrote a book. She's passionate about noodles and dumplings, and then this Asian American attacked her for it, saying this is like cultural appropriation and things like that. And it was just this really weird thing. Like, I mean, noodles and dumplings, strictly speaking, isn't only an Asian thing to begin with. But aside from that argument, and regardless of that argument, I just thought it was weird. So I showed my support. I just said, this is really weird. I'm sorry you're going through this, but I hope it brings, awareness to your other work as well, because she's a cancer researcher. And then so this one guy, this Nepal born Tibetan, retweets me and says, isn't this the guy that went to Tibet and saw happy people and said nothing's wrong here? And I was like, this is another superficial kind of a thing. I mean, I've been to Tibet twice. The first time was I did the Kora around Kailash Mountain, which is known as a very spiritual kind of a journey. It was a 54-kilometer hike that reached altitudes of 5,800 meters. It was an epic trip. I did it in one day, 17 and a half hours straight. And I did it with Tibetans. And I got to know a lot of locals. And so, Tibet holds a special place in my heart. And I've got a lot of friends there. So I really get annoyed at these kinds of superficial assessments of my opinion on Tibet. So it did get a little bit combative. I'll say that up front. But I'll share some screenshots from our interactions. Yeah, so forgive me here. I'll be doing a little bit more of the talking here to just talk to go through this piece at the end. But yeah, so he says, I blurred him out because I have very mixed feelings about this guy. I don't really hate him or anything like that, and I'll get into that in a bit. So he says, isn't this the YouTuber that went on a trip to Tibet and declared that everything was fine because the Tibetans he met were smiling and laughing at him? So I'm skipping through some of the different things, but here, we got into a little bit of a discussion, and he says, Daniel, weaponizing the state logic of terrorism against brown people is not the base to look that you think it is. And I said, I didn't think you could. So this is already after quite a lot of arguing back and forth. I said, I didn't think you could possibly outdo yourself, but I must say, lecturing a brown guy about state logic and terrorism against brown people while working with organizations funded by the National Endowment for Democracy is hands down the most spectacular thing I've seen, because obviously the National Endowment of Democracy targets a lot of countries with brown people in them and destabilizes their governments or installs dictators. And it says, Daniel, my guy, I wasn't the one to invoke the menace of terrorism to invite state repression. And I said, instead of digging yourself into a deeper hole here, how about you do something useful for your ironic sponsors, one of the largest perpetrators of global terrorism, and perhaps try to reboot Camp Hale or something during which you can think up a coherent argument to return with. And he says, wait, I'm sorry, you're not white? And so that's when he left me alone and went after you, but I'll explain that after. But just to explain Camp Hale is the U.S. government sponsored the camp that they set up in Colorado to radicalize Tibetans or radicalize people who are going to go back and fight for Tibet, drop them off in Nepal to basically attack Tibet. Before I go on, it looked like you wanted to say something. Did you want to interject?
So I found something wild here. Just because I was looking through some of these threads, I just to see what the reaction was again. Somebody compared the Canadophiles and me to saying I was outdoing Joseph Goebbels, who was the main Nazi propagandist for the Nazi regime.
Then his attack on you, yeah.
Yep, I had some person say CTFU. I had somebody from the Students for Free Tibet Canada board say that this was an example of CCP propaganda, complaining because I think I had run into her at some sort of panel I was speaking at back when I was in high school. And then I didn't realize this, but Terry Glavin, back on April 15th, this guy said the Canadophiles crowd is nuts. So I realized this. Even Terry Glavin got triggered by the Canadophiles work. This is wild. Wow.
Yeah. So I'm going to get to his attack on you in a sec. So I don't know if I've exactly put all of these in the right order, but I'll go through some of the interactions here. So he says, he's asking about, but seriously, who are you to question how resistance movements build allyship? And so I asked him, I said, if you don't mind, because he said earlier he's willing to have a sincere conversation. How do you feel that you're connected with an org that even the Dalai Lama's brother regretted working with, and said that they're just turned Tibet into another Iraq, Libya, or Syria? So obviously the NED being a CIA cutout, and drawing the lines about what would have actually happened if they succeeded. And he still didn't want to answer. So later on I said, why don't you address the actual question? And then he said he didn't really know about the NED. He says, you keep tossing around the NED. I know what the F it is. So then I give him a clip that shows all of the interference operations that they've done, the governments that they've overthrown, how global capitalism works. And then he goes on to say, people seek allies where they can. Sure, it's driven by self-interest and maybe poorly thought out, but ultimate concern is for my people and our self-determination. And so I say, can you see why when past poorly thought out alliances, like the same kinds of alliances you had, driven by self-interest, caused greater tragedy and suffering? It causes folks to take issue with your short-sightedness. I tried to find a nicer way to word this, but I couldn't. Sorry. I really did want to have a productive conversation here, so I didn't want to use the word short-sightedness, but with the limitation of Twitter, this is what I could summarize. It says, but these are all problems that are for us to sort out and not for China, and certainly not for you. And then he goes into Cuba and Haiti, a little bit off topic. And I said, I didn't really get an answer for you, but would it be a correct summary to say that you believe you have the right to work with people who have no problem destroying the lives of people in Tibet and who funded rebel invasions into the territory because you share DNA with them, correct? And he's like, what the F are you talking about? How can Tibetans invade their own country? And so I reiterated, I said, so it is ancestral based. This isn't about Tibetans invading. It's about the U.S. invading and using Tibetan descendants with an adequate understanding of history and a propagandized understanding of modern Tibet to accomplish what the U.S. wants, not you, and it ends in destruction. So before I go on from that, this is obviously one of the big issues that I have. Is obviously I care about Tibet. I care about the people of Tibet, but also I care about not allowing the U.S. to continue doing these kinds of things, because ultimately it would end with the destruction of these regions, as we've seen over and over again. And he doesn't care. He says that's up to him. Now, what's interesting is that in his own podcast, because I have a lot of friends in the Tibetan overseas community, born into exile, he had some really interesting reflections in his podcast that happened before this interaction that should have allowed him to empathize with some of these thoughts. And I'll get into that in a minute, because it also ties into how he attacked you. When he realized I wasn't white, I wasn't an easy enough target. So what he did was he went after you for even liking my tweets, which was really interesting. So he decided to go on a meltdown on you. So he says, sorry, no, here we go. Yeah. So he says to you, also, I see you liking this tweet, Aidan, you photo stealing racist little creep. And then you just didn't want to engage. So, and he says, you're a man, I don't want to repeat all these insults, but he really lays into you. And he says that, okay, here's the important part. Rather than working to dismantle settler colonial and white supremacist power structures that surround us like air here, you found a small group of refugees to sensationalize and demonize, because that's how white people like you have always reckoned with power. It's predictable. This is really ironic. We are actually the ones who are disseminating this kind of thing. He is the one who's acting as a tool for those very powers. He's the one who's working with literal CIA-funded groups to accomplish exactly what he's saying you should be taking apart. And so this is where it gets interesting for me. My overseas Tibetan friend reached out to me, and this is part of the reason why I blurred his name out, because I kind of have mixed feelings about him. And he said, you know what? When you compare the different kinds of people, he says, I listened to his podcast, and when you compare the kinds of people in the Tibetan community, this guy's actually one of the more open-minded ones. And he directed me to a part of his podcast where he was talking about things like saying, reflecting on the fact that Tibetans aren't allowed to disagree with each other in their community. Should we have just one cohesive, argument? Shouldn't we allow room for discussion? And then the other thing that he pointed out when he asked himself was, he says, we are a very small community of Tibetans outside of Tibet. We're only like, what is it, less than 10% of the population. Do we have the right to speak for Tibetans in Tibet? Like, he was asking himself some really critical questions, which my friend said is very unusual. And in his journey, because a lot of my overseas Tibetan friends who were born overseas are pro-China, he said these are the kinds of questions that they started asking themselves before they became a little bit more open-minded. Now, the irony here is, though, if he's willing to say that we need to be more careful about this, we're a small community speaking for a large population in Tibet, he needs to be more alert and open-minded to when other people, regardless if they're of Tibetan descent or not, go to Tibet and see that the situation is very different from what's being portrayed in the media. What would have been even better if he went and visited himself and saw for himself. Then the other irony, of course, is that he acknowledges that there's no room for dissent within the overseas Tibetan community. And that's exactly why pro-China overseas Tibetans can't speak up. My friend would never, ever speak up publicly about this because of the structures in place. So when I'm speaking about my experiences, when I'm speaking about Tibet, I'm also guided by these overseas Tibetans who aren't allowed to speak up. And they're not allowed to have a voice. And that's why you have such a skewed narrative from these people. So I was really I was half disappointed because he's halfway there. He's asking these critical questions, but he's doing everything in opposition from what logic should tell him to do based on these epiphanies and based on these questions. So it's a really interesting dynamic, and that's what's happening behind the scenes. If my friend spoke up publicly about how pro-China he is, or why he's positive about China, what he saw in China for himself after he visited, he would be completely destroyed. The community would come after him. If he does business or he tries to interact with the community, they would completely ostracize him from the community. There's no room for that kind of discussion. So that's also what goes on behind the scenes in terms of the conversation overseas and why it's so one-sided as well. But how did you? I mean, so what was your reaction to when he came after you, other than just being kind of finding it funny that he went after you for just liking my tweet, and seeing those comments from him?
I think it was mainly just being kind of bemused. I mean, I was just like, why are you bothering with this? Like, the main way I use Twitter is I'm not the kind of person to engage in beef sort of stuff per se. It's very much just do the journalism, do that stuff behind the scenes, chat with people once in a while where it makes sense. And so having someone just come after me like that is like, I very much expect it because of the nature of the work that's the Canada Files does. It just angers people who support imperial narratives because it's almost impossible to debunk or it is impossible to go after debunk the arguments and investigations we do. So to a certain degree, I think the lashing out the way it is inevitable. All people have is saying that the Canada Files is nuts, like Terry Glavin did. All the people have is saying I'm some sort of weird man-child or something like the other person is saying. That's all they have. That's all they have.
Yeah, they're not going after the actual content, which is full of references and everything like that. And it's unfortunate. I mean, so my friend also, he says that he said that this guy is on the right track, or maybe he won't change his mind any more than he already is now, but he's asking some really good questions. But my friend said he hasn't had the benefit of finally realizing that it's him that's the outsider, that it's him who's been propagandized. And my Tibetan friend, and of course there's differentiating opinions. I'm not going to say that my friend's opinion is 100% correct, but he said that you do go through a process when you finally, for the people who do finally change their mind, is where you realize that we're the outsiders in the overseas Tibetan community. We're the ones who have been propagandized. We're the ones who have been brainwashed since we were children. The community in China, the Tibetan community, has moved on and their lives have become prosperous and they're happy. He's gone and seen it for himself. He's lived with them for quite a while. He moved to China. He's back overseas, but he had these experiences, and it's not just him. I have multiple friends in that community, and they and some of them watch all of my content, especially when I'm talking about Tibet, and they're constantly giving me feedback as well. They're telling me where they think I got it right, where they think I got it wrong. And these are voices that you can't have in the overseas community. And I think people need to realize that too, because a lot of people ask that question, or at least I've seen it a couple of times. They're like, well, why are all these overseas Tibetans so negative? Or why are all these overseas Uyghurs so negative? It's because of the way that the system is set up, that there's no room for dissent. It happens in the Uyghur community too, and is arguably even more dangerous. When a German Uyghur student, a Chinese Uyghur student, spoke up when she was upset about these sanctions on cotton, because she knows that all in the South, the Uyghurs have their own plots of land, they grow their own cotton, it's their source of income, and she was pushing back against the propaganda. She got doxxed. Her address was published online, and she had to delete her YouTube account, and she just shut up. And when you're talking about in the Uyghur community, now you're talking about people who are involved in extremist groups as well, who are involved in ETIM. There are 10,000 Uyghurs in Syria fighting alongside Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Like, you're talking about a more serious issue here. So she just said, this isn't worth the risk. She posted some updates on Chinese social media saying, this is what happened. My address was revealed. I started getting calls or whatever it was. And she just decided that's too much for her. So she just closed her YouTube down. So it's not that these voices don't exist. It's not that there's two sides to this conversation. It's that nobody's getting a chance to hear the other side. So that's where people like myself and people like you come in, where I'm connected to some of that community that wants to speak up in the other direction. And you focus on the factual side of things, saying, okay, well, let me present these facts that the mainstream media is completely leaving out and not talking about. And I think it's very telling when people from that community who are on the negative side of things, all they can come back with is you're a man-child. It says a lot about what the state is of the quality of their narrative is. But yeah, I don't know if you had any other final thoughts on that, but that was the kind of thing, the pieces that I wanted to wrap up with there.
Yeah, no, it's totally fair there. I mean, Yasha Levine's done great work on he's talked about like weaponized immigrants. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work, but that kind of, sometimes it kind of strikes me as that kind of case. But I mean, with the Tibetan dissidents in Canada, the interesting thing is, especially with someone like Students for Free Tibet Canada, I really get the sense that they genuinely, like, they do care about these causes
right.
of general leftism or these kind of things. General, I say, not really hard leftism in any way, but general. But they're just so easily manipulated. And that's the key, is manipulation. And of course, of inventing reality at its very core. That's the biggest thing I get the sense of. And I mean, that's the role where the Canada Files plays at the end of the day. It's kind of, I think in my view, it's the function of a media outlet like this, in what it should be doing is very much clearing the way for people that might have more at risk or that can't really talk about these things, to give them the ground for them to stand on when they talk about these things, to lead on that front. So
I think that's a really important thing to talk about, inventing reality, and understand that these people that are aligning with the NED and aligning with all these people, and they don't see through the irony of calling you supporting the kind of, colonialism and all this stuff, when it's actually the complete opposite, and actually they're being used as a tool for that very thing. These aren't bad people. They really believe in what they're doing. They've been propagandized in their community. My friend, the same friend, he says that, for example, in the European Tibetan community, there's a lot of Tibetans who were born in India, born in exile. And what they do is they migrate to Europe. They throw away their identity documents, and they say they escaped Tibet, and they apply for asylum to live in European countries. And they come up with these fantastical stories of witnessing their mother being raped by Chinese soldiers and stuff like that, even though they've never set foot in Tibet ever. And then I've heard that a lot of these European countries, they know that they're, BS stories. You've got these Tibetans showing up with an Indian accent, and, they know that they've never been to Tibet. But they accept them because it goes towards some sort of a quota for accepting, asylum or refugee statuses. And generally speaking, they're a community that doesn't cause too much trouble. But he says, even though these people are lying, he says, when you go out with them and you go drinking with them or something like that in a bar, some of them, they break down crying when they're talking about Tibet. And they've never been to Tibet, and they really believe everything they've been told, and their emotions are 100% real. And he just finds it bizarre because obviously he, unlike them, he's been to Tibet, and he knows what's really going on. But he can't tell these people either. When he tells these people and he challenges their understanding of Tibet, he gets a lot of backlash. People aren't ready to hear anything other than what they've been taught since they were a child, since they were a baby, being grown up, being raised into these narratives. And when somebody actively asks him, says, "Oh, you've been to Tibet. What is it like?" He's even got to be really, really careful. Like if he says, "Actually, it's progressing a lot. The people are really happy," they'll get offended by that answer. So there's a really interesting dynamic going on where, like you were saying, inventing reality, where these narratives have been ingrained so deep into their system that it's not a matter of these being bad people. It's a matter of them just being, having this crazy reality invented for them, to use the word that you're bringing up here.
Yeah, there really is manipulation at its very core. And I mean that's the thing about why, when you have groups like Students for Free Tibet Canada, like NATO Association of Canada, and a lot of these other organizations basically going around being so lacking so much transparency and then pushing these crazy falsical narratives, is that they can get away with it because there is that inherent propaganda barrier that is built into every single layer of our education, society, media, activism. Every single front of society is really built another level to propagandize people into being good little soldiers for the imperial war narratives. And that's what has to be fought.
Yeah, and no, definitely. And when we're talking about in the Tibetan community in India, it's even more extreme. Like you can look up cases, like everybody's talking about these self-immolations from people who have been radicalized and they've chosen this as their method of suicide. It happens in India as well. Like there was for example, a teenager who has never ever stepped foot in Tibet.
I think we've lost Daniel for a second there. But don't worry, he'll be back in a few seconds.
Yep,
hey, there you are, Daniel.
We were having way more problems earlier on. But to finish that story, there was a teenager in India, for example, and this happens a lot in India, who self-immolated, lit himself on fire for the Tibet cause. He was a teenager who had never, ever been to Tibet in his life. He did this based on secondhand information that he was given to by his community. That was the lengths that he was willing to go to. I want to show you another video of somebody else who'd been radicalized, because when myself and somebody named Samira Khan was pushing back against the Tibet narrative as well, we became under attack. And that's when can you still hear me? Am I still coming through okay?
No, I can hear you.
Okay, good. Yeah. So we came under attack, and they also brought out children to talk about myself and Samira Khan. And let me show you an example and listen to the words he's saying when I play this example for you, and you'll get an idea of how radicalized people can become by these ideologies. This is nothing short of child abuse. I'll play it for you now.
Human beings like us, Tibetans, kids like me, 10-year-olds, we are all scarred because of you.
Is it playing?
You have not just hurt one person. You have scarred more than 535 million people. Even I, a 10-year-old, can risk my life. Even my life is on the line. I can do anything for His Holiness, the 14th Dalai Lama. But if this happens next time, if this happens again, next time it won't look pretty.
Sorry, I don't know if I stopped that. I don't know if I stopped that early, and it didn't show up for me. So I'm going to have to go on memory. I haven't watched that for many months.
Yeah, it worked.
So what I remember him saying, because I'm going to have to go off of memory, is that he's willing to do anything for the Dalai Lama. Yep. I can't remember if he used the word. Did he use the word willing to die for the Dalai Lama?
I don't know if he said that directly, but it's that general hint. There's a general hint of.
Yeah. So and he was saying that we can do anything we want. I don't know if we got to that part because So a lot of people don't appreciate that, extremism within the Buddhist community. The Buddhist community had also persecuted Shugden Buddhists and all this kind of stuff quite violently. But if you took that and you turned that into, for example, a Muslim kid in France talking like that, saying that we can do, I'm willing to do anything for Allah, or I'm do all this kind of stuff, Westerners would have, because they've been propagandized by a lot of Islamophobic content as well, they'd be more willing to recognize the issue with that. But this is a kid in India, in the exile community. This is the way that they're being raised. So you can imagine if he's already speaking like that at this age, what happens to that? What happens to their mind by the time they reach an adult? And now you can start to appreciate why when my friend went through a very difficult process of undoing everything he learned about China to say, hold on a second, we're the ones who are propagandized. How difficult of a process that is, and how much of a backlash he gets. Like when this kid grows up, if my friend in the overseas Tibetan community wanted to have a chat with him and say, you're actually wrong, this is what I saw with my own eyes, it's a conversation that's not going to go well, or it's not going to be an easy conversation, that's for sure. So I think these are things that people need to understand about the community as well. But I think what we'll do, just before we run into any more technical issues here, I'll wrap it up at that. And I'm going to encourage people, and I'll put the link in the description to Canada Files where people can go over and check you out. Also show their support if they wish. But I want to give you the last few words, what you'd like to say to the audience about the conversation and what you do.
Yeah, for sure. So I think at its very core, the most important thing is just to always be questioning the imperial narratives that we're facing. And so really with the Canada Files, obviously we are undergoing the very first fundraising campaign that we've ever done after 20 months of these investigations. And as I've laid on the line very clearly, there is an incredibly strong need for a leading kind of media figure to do these investigations and to challenge Canadian imperialism at the base of the superstructure in ways that can really challenge these analyses, not go off of purely individual basis or make it a one-time issue as some do. This is a very core issue of the superstructure, and that's what the Canada Files does, what it provides. And so we're really hoping to hit around $7,500 a month. That allows me and Daniel to do this as a minimum wage job, just a minimum wage job, nothing glorious. But we're around like
we're talking about a different Daniel, just to be clear. Daniel
Z, who's the associate editor of the Canada Files. So we're around $600 a month currently, Canadian a month, into that goal. So we've made some progress, but the support is very, very much needed because this is going to take years upon years upon years upon years of work to really help a lot of people break through that propaganda barrier. And so it's been such a pleasure and such a great chance to really take these risks and do this work. But the backing is really key to enable this to go on and to go forward. So the donation link should be below, and if people could donate and support that, it's really key in supporting a long-term initiative and really just to take these things forward into the future. This is going to be something that I want to be doing that the Canada Files should be working and doing these things for decades. This is not an institution that's going to just come up in smoke and disappear. It's a long-term, hardworking media institution.
For sure. Yeah. No, I hope to see you continue doing what you're doing. Any plans for, or I don't know if you already have one, a YouTube channel or anything like that?
Yes. If people search up the Canada Files, it'll be there.
Perfect.
And if you find us on social media, just search up the Canada Files.
Yeah. Well, you know what? We'll wrap it up there and let people follow through to those links to check out your work for themselves. But really appreciate you taking the time, and I'm looking forward to your future reports.
Thank you. It's the pleasure is mine to be able to come on. So I have much respect for your work, and I really appreciate the chance to platform the work that's being done here. It's really appreciated.
Sounds great. All right. I'll catch you soon. And thanks everybody for joining.
Thank you.